going?
Let's go.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, Cass has got it recording, got everybody, on screen, loving this. Cool. Well, thanks for coming to this truly fireside chat.
There is more of that.
Yeah, a little bit there. I'm gonna get burned. But super fun, because of course we're gonna be diving into the job search process, which who doesn't like talking about that kind of stuff. And then probably the most exciting piece of the job search process is writing a resume. Like, yeah, exactly. So we'll chat for a little bit, and then of course, because the goal at the end of the day is always to help each and every one of your individual challenges, because most people are kind of experiencing something a little bit different in the job search. Just feel free to jump on in, ask any questions that you might have, and we'll power through this sun, the wind, and any of the characters that come by in front of us, which is always fun too. So let's start out with a little bit of background on Sarah. Sarah's dog Mila is also here as well.
She's very much alive.
She's
You might see her.
yeah, she's learning how to write resumes herself, because it's a very it's going to be a big industry for pet work here in the
Standard
future.
skill.
So you went to UCLA, you majored in political science, and then your career took you through HR. How do you end up in HR? Like, is that something that you were just aspiring to your whole life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So most of my jobs, I started in sports, right? So when I was in school at UCLA, I started working for the Daily Bruin, where I was a sports editor. I covered football, basketball, baseball, you name it. And then I graduated and went on to work for the Boston Red Sox. So my first job with the Red Sox was in the ticket office. And so I quickly learned that I wasn't really interested in the transactional, like one-on-one relationship.
Sales.
Yeah, exactly. I was more interested in building long-term relationships and helping people grow. So what I did was I went to the HR person and was like, hey, this is what I'm interested in doing. Like, do you have any recommendations for the function or department that I should pursue? And she's like, well, like HR sounds really good for you, actually. And so she chatted through with me the different responsibilities, everything that fell under HR, like recruiting or relations or events or benefits or clients or all those different things, because it is quite a bucket of HR stuff, right? So the long story short is that there was an opening in HR that following year, which I was hired into, and that's where I had my first opportunity for recruiting. So I ended up hiring, I can't even remember now, that first year, I think I had maybe like 30 full-time positions that I hired for, plus any event staff, like game day operations, interns. And it's a big company. At that time, there were 1,800 employees. Now I can't even imagine. But in that recruiting function, I saw a crap ton of resumes. You hire for all different kinds of roles, like IT or marketing or finance or fan services or sales.
Just a few different types.
It's really all over the board. And so for me, that was really helpful because I got to see the different kinds of skill sets that hiring managers were looking for and how they kind of interpreted the skill sets of the marketplace and how they translated into the jobs that we offered. Because sports too, we don't necessarily think that from a business standpoint that these skills really matter. Like that's not the first thing you think of, but if you noodle on it a little bit, you really understand, especially nowadays. I first started, it was 2012. So this was about 8-9 years ago, and the landscape was very different. So today, you have organizations in sports, whether it be MLB, the NFL, the NBA, they are very much businesses. And so they look at resumes like any other like Fortune 500 company would. So I was very lucky that I got to see it at that level and really like understand what it was that hiring managers were looking for and how they kind of calibrated the candidates that came in.
So for anybody who hasn't been inside of an organization, worked in HR themselves, you have this role, human resources, and then as you described, you have a long list of responsibilities, and just one of those happens to be hiring.
That's correct, exactly.
So if like we were talking about a typical day, what would you say if like it was a busy season of hiring? How many different roles would you be working on at that one time?
That's a great question. So at any given time, I would probably have at least 10 different positions, and that would cost between, I remember at this one specific time, right before I left, I had like 3 roles in the accounting department that were open simply because there was some turnover. Excuse me, I had one IT role. I had a chief engineer position. That was interesting. This was in the video production department, but people that were in charge of like the Jumbotron and like the stuff that like went on the Jumbotron during baseball games, and any other like in-game media. I think I was helping to hire my backfill, so an HR position.
Was that one of the easier ones?
Yeah, that was more of a, hey, like I think this person would be good, but you know, like not having any skin in the game per se. So yeah, it really just depends on any given time. You know, turnover you can't predict. Like we like to think with an organization to try to at least anticipate what that looks like from a succession planning standpoint. Generally, I think some of the best practices for employers are such that whenever, like once a year, at least you go through an exercise of succession planning. So you go through every person in your organization and say, like, if this person were to leave, like what would the strategy be to like help kind of not necessarily backfill them, but to help support in a transition while you're backfilling. So, and that's really difficult to do. I mean, we all like have jobs to do like on top of that. So that's more of a strategy thing. And technically that, I would say usually that lies with leadership. But in general, I think just even as employees, that's always good to be thinking about. Especially if you have a team reporting to you, you know, you want to know, like, if this person left, like, could we be okay as a team and still could like produce our output in a way that is productive.
So would both HR and the managers themselves be, I mean, you know, occasionally you would be actively thinking about it. You would be having these succession plannings. But outside of that, it sounds like you'd even be keeping an eye out for potential people that can fill these roles for when they open up.
Absolutely. So we call that pipeline building, right? So that's always, you know, it's what job fairs are for in most cases. You know, you don't necessarily want to go to a job fair like with a role in your hand to be like, hey, like you should apply for this job or whatever. You want to meet people. I mean, and that's great. Like it's great to do that. But on top of that, you want to be able to meet with the people just kind of objectively and say, oh, like this is a great resume, like this is like, you know, you're great to talk to, what are you interested in, and then have that be something where you can go back to the office, put them in your ATS system, be like, when I have a marketing coordinator position that's focused on graphic design, I want to call this person, right? Like that's kind of the active pipeline building.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's, so again, a very strategic way to look at it.
So, you know, actively kind of trying to do it, but then at the same time being open to it, and hopefully what people are kind of taking away from this is, you know, reach out to companies that you're interested in, kind of get on their radar so that when something does open up, at least there is either your resume in the pipeline, maybe you've had a chance to talk to somebody.
Exactly. I always say too, it's really helpful from a practice standpoint, once a quarter, so like 4 times a year, to reach out to a company or a contact that you might have, or even just cold connect with somebody on LinkedIn. To like take a coffee meeting or a phone call just informationally, because a lot of times those conversations can lead to opportunities down the line, and it may take a few years, but those are the seeds that you want to plant, especially if you have a dream company that you want to work for, or there's a dream function that you're interested in. Like those are the kind of like non-aggressive ways to do it, where you're literally just trying to learn and educate yourself. And generally people respond to that. People love to give advice, you know, and they love to share their experiences. So in a forum like that, I find really helpful.
People like talking about themselves.
They do. They absolutely do. Exactly. It's a very like low inertia way to do it.
Hey, I'm really impressed with the role that you're in. I really like the company you're working for. Can we, you know, chat?
Mentor me.
And then you just copy and paste that message and send it to like 7 or 8 different people. Somebody's going to respond.
Exactly.
So you wrote a book on how to write a resume.
I sure did.
Which,
yes, I did.
I mean, you know, it's funny because so many people say, they're like, oh, well, you know, either what do I put on a resume, or this is the format for a resume that you should have. Why, let's start with the very basic. Why do you think resumes are still used and needed, even though we have LinkedIn, we have these applications that people have to fill out, there's networking involved, like it feels a little bit old school.
It is. It's very much old school. It's funny, actually. I think I wrote a blog post about this, And there, I think there's an excerpt in my book about it, but the first resume was actually written by Leonardo da Vinci, like as we know it today.
No way.
And it's not like, obviously, like, the standard format has evolved, but basically he's listing his qualifications. I don't even remember like what he was necessarily applying for, but he was listing his skills as they were relevant to whatever the opportunity was. And, it was probably like some like cattle, like rearing, something, typical of his time, right? The artist applying for like this barnyard job, right?
Yeah.
So as it relates to today, it's interesting because in my experience, I find the resume to be a very, it's kind of the commonplace standard baseline that everybody's familiar with, right? So, you could apply to any company and they will know what a resume is, right? I think we're still in a time where there are, like some companies don't necessarily use LinkedIn yet. Most do, don't get me wrong, but there are some,
Most should.
mom and pop shops, like smaller businesses don't necessarily use it. If they don't have the staff they need, then they, that like some other companies might have, so the volume, like the juice might not be worth the squeeze, so to speak. Investing that time just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Or just was never on their radar.
Right.
They've never needed to, never think about it.
Right.
So there are companies that don't use LinkedIn. I know I love it, and I think you like it. Yeah.
I do. Yeah. And it really depends too on what your goals are. And I will always like use this as a caveat that understand it, like first and foremost, the goal I think is to understand your goals and what you want your outcome to be, and then tailor your search accordingly. And that will affect where you apply, who you contact, how you contact them, all of those things. And so kind of to start with that macro view, and then like let that funnel your focus down on how you reach out to people and what it is that you send them, things like that.
Yeah.
So, and again, like that resume is the very standard piece. I personally think that there's not necessarily things on a resume that we can't find on other things, but we're still in a place where people are just super familiar with it, and it's the easiest, least common denominator for people to look at when they're making a decision, or at least when they're considering folks for an open opportunity, because we know there's always the referrals or the networking or whatever, and we get people in our pipeline based on that. But at the end of the day, you're always going to ask for a resume.
Yeah. No, I think I've even gone through hiring processes where I knew I had the job, and then at some point they said, hey, we just need a resume on file.
It's a formality.
Exactly.
A lot of the time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Very much so.
It's kind of a given.
Right. To make sure you're a human.
Yeah. No,
with like experience.
Well, and what's tough too is that even though you're getting this resume and people can kind of fake it, and you're supposed to be presenting what it is that you've done, and then provide kind of links and access to these other references and resources, it still feels a little bit nerve-wracking. It's writing at the end of the day, which is one of your passions.
It is.
So how can somebody, let's say maybe who isn't a great writer, feel comfortable putting together a resume?
Absolutely. So I think some of the best tips and tricks for calibrating a resume is to focus on the story that you want to tell. And what I mean by that is a lot of this will depend on the roles that you're applying for. And I could go all over the place with this, but I'm going to start with one, like say like I'm applying for an HR manager position, and they're looking for, a generalist background. So they want, somebody who's had a little bit of recruiting, a little bit of benefits, a little bit of payroll, a little bit of employee relations, whatever. And so I'm going to include information on my resume that speaks specifically to those responsibilities that they want this person to have. And I'm going to highlight my specific achievements that I've done at previous companies to show that I'm qualified for it, and that I've contributed amply to the success of my company based on this particular function, right? So in that case, I will always use numbers. Numbers are hugely important. That if that's like the one thing you take away from this, always use numbers.
Yeah. Everybody likes numbers.
Everybody likes numbers. It's a universal language, right? Like quantify your experience. I know it's more difficult for some positions than others. I absolutely understand, but there is always a way, I promise. Make sure that you're showing how you contributed to the organization, to your team, even if your role, especially if you're in an entry-level role and it's not necessarily like tangible to you, talk to your manager, talk to your team, understand the impact that any projects you're working on has on the company. Use those numbers, because you're contributing, to make sure you say, I contributed to this and this was the outcome, just so there is that truth and that mention of that impact. But not only, you know, are you mentioning the numbers, but then you're showing that you understand how your role within the company is impactful and meaningful so that you can articulate that on another level. So it's all different levels of storytelling. The numbers are hugely important. And then the other point I want to make is transferable skills. So,
which I got wrong earlier. What did I say? Translatable skills?
I think it's the same idea.
Okay, same but different. Here we go.
Same but different. So what I mean by transferable skills is there are things that we do in jobs that may not necessarily have the same vocabulary. So for example, like me as a recruiter, I sell all the time. Like when I, like in a recruiting function, I was selling to candidates and I was selling to hiring managers. For the candidates, I was selling the opportunity, the company, the employee experience, etc. To the employer, I was selling the candidate, you know, what they could contribute, how they would impact the company positively, etc. So I would use, if I, you know, for example, like if I wanted to go into a business development role for a pharmaceutical company, I could still use my experience in recruiting and frame it in such a way to show the hiring manager of this pharmaceutical company that I could sell, right? That I know how to pitch, that I know how to create a narrative, that I know how to manage volume, the number of requisitions I hired for, turnover, like things like that. So there are certainly ways to do it. It's just a matter of how you get creative with it and think about what that can look like based on the opportunities that you're considering and what you've done in your past.
And then would an easy kind of like hack at that be just kind of taking the job description that somebody's looking at, essentially saying I've done that, and then finding a way to include it on your resume?
Exactly. And so job descriptions typically, you know, they obviously are descriptive and they share in an ideal scenario what the person would be doing or performing in that role, right? It's like that's always the ideal. And then there's always, you know, the other duties as assigned caveat at the bottom, right? Because, you know, things change, environment changes, the world that we live in changes so quickly that, you know, you could be hired to be, you know, doing one thing and then you absorb all these other responsibilities because somebody leaves your second day on the job, and so you inherit all these other things, whatever the situation is. So yes, the short answer is that yes, there is a good way if you're looking at, especially if you're looking at a job description, always focus on the keywords too, that the words that occur most frequently, and use those in your resume to showcase your experience and how it's relevant. So that's like a really good way to immediately draw the parallels and create that synchronicity between the opportunity and your experience.
So speaking of keywords, one of the, what is it? Like, I don't know if it's like a fear. I don't know if it's, you know, an overblown myth. People talk about ATS systems all the time, applicant tracking systems, and how your resume has to beat the applicant tracking system. How much of that is true? How much, as somebody who was looking at these resumes, was it filtering out people, or was it simply organizing them based off of their match?
That's a good question. And it really, it's probably the most hated answer of all time, but it really depends on the company. It's really interesting because there are some companies that are certainly more sophisticated when it comes to integrating the technology and understanding the algorithms and using, you know, what was once called Boolean logic. I don't even know if that's used anymore.
I think so.
Yeah, like the search strings for how to find. I used to use it all the time, like on LinkedIn when I was looking for certain experiences and backgrounds, things like that, when I was looking for passive candidates. And in an ATS system, it's the same kind of logic applies, and for most software technology, right? Because there's little nuances depending on, you know, whether you're using an SAP SuccessFactors or ADP or Greenhouse or like whatever other system is out there. And then some people or some companies too still are very much analog and will still have you email a resume to their inbox. And there's a human going through and downloading each attachment and sending it to the hiring manager and calibrating it that way. So my best advice for that is to always make it as least common denominator as possible. And so in this situation, it's maximizing the keyword search for those ATS systems, but then also making it readable. Don't put pictures, don't put clip art, don't do anything like fancy. Literally just use text. Text, that's all you need. It's really not like, it doesn't need to be fancy. There's some systems out there too that will generate resumes for you and use, you know, super pretty background for. It's just my
It's
recommendation.
wild.
It's crazy. Like, and I get it, like from an aesthetic standpoint, like obviously, yeah, like you want it to be pretty, but like when you're looking at or you have a system, a sophisticated, you know, with a sophisticated algorithm, it's not going to be able to read that. At least like most nowadays are still not able to read.
I heard that even like something as simple as a table. So like if you're trying to organize, you know, your skills into like 3 columns or something like that, and then you wanted to remove the border.
I hate the columns.
Oh, okay.
Myself, I like, especially for the eye, like if you look at eye tracking studies, like your eye kind of goes into an S curve type thing. So you want to have, you know, just one column, the name of the company, the title, the years you worked there, and then your bullets, right? And then even within the bullets, what I suggest is if there's certain functions that you perform. So like for me as an HR person, I would have recruiting, I would have benefits, I would have payroll, and then I'd have my achievements in a subcategory. Just because for the brain, it's a lot easier to read through those and to kind of categorize those things rather than looking at 6 to 10 bullets that are just information, you know, like, and that's again, like to job seekers, I think the best thing you can do is to help tell your story is to curate your content in a way that leads your hiring manager or leads your recruiter to your story without like with the least inertia as possible, and just telling and literally like telling them the story. Come on. Bye. He's leaving. Hello.
Let's see if there's, sorry, I'm gonna go up here and see if there's any questions in the chat. I'm guessing there isn't yet. There isn't any questions. It's just a confirmation of carpooling. Okay, cool.
Questions, people.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, something I think that, you know, is a good point there is the fact that you really want to make it as easy as possible on the recruiter, the HR person, because they're already having to look through what, I mean, how many resumes would you typically get for a role?
It really depends. I've probably seen like, oh my gosh, tens of thousands of resumes in my career.
Oh, sounds like fun.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. So like for the person who's reading them, you know, we're obviously looking for certain pieces of information, certain levels of experience, things like that. And every hiring manager is going to have a different calibration or baseline criteria that they screen for, right? So the most logical way for a hiring manager to do it is, okay, like what are my deal breakers? And you screen for those first. So if you don't meet their deal breaker, like you're not going to get past that first step, right? So it's like, again, that's why it's important to look at the job description and really calibrate your content based on those minimum requirements and make sure that you can communicate that, and then use those numbers to help tell the story of your background and experience.
So like thinking about calibrating based off of the job requirements, if somebody's putting a job description together and they have like this, you know, list of bullet pointed requirements on their technical skills, roles and responsibilities, is it safe to say that they're probably going to put the most important ones closer to the top?
Probably. Yeah. I think that's a fair, not always, but most likely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely most likely.
So outside of course, resume writing is another fun act of writing, which is cover letters.
Yay!
How do you fall on cover letters? Like, would you read them yourself?
So it really depends on the role.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So for me personally, more technical roles, I really don't care
Okay.
like what your writing ability looks like per se. Like I just, because it's not imperative to the job, unless you're maybe a more senior person. But if you're a software engineer, like a 1 or 2, or a data architect, like I really don't care. Like that's like just true story. Like it doesn't matter to me. But if you're in marketing or in HR or in sales, it's going to matter to me, right? Because I want to know that you can tell a story in the about the workplace and convince me that there's something that I want to buy or consume or look at or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So to me, like, and that's just my opinion. Like I'm sure other hiring managers of software engineers that would tell you otherwise that they want to see, you know, but that's just my opinion. I do think it's important. It's another opportunity for you to tell the story, and it's probably the more straightforward means to tell your story, because it's literally like paragraphs of words that speak to your experience. And so it's a more linear way to do that. In terms of formatting, you know, I would go with the classic intro, hi, my name is Sara Salam. I'm interested in your recruiting opportunity. And then the body is based on, the experience that I've had. I've seen 30,000 resumes. I've hired, over, I don't even know however many
too many.
I've had. Yeah, right, exactly. This is the impact on the companies that I've had. The hires that I've made have generated X amount of dollars in revenue for the company, things like that. So, and dollars speak, let me tell you, dollars speak to most
Equate
companies.
everything to money.
Yeah. Bottom line, they do dollars, percentages, growth, ROI, all cost savings, all of that is those are good things to include. And so a cover letter is really just a more narrative based, like a narrative based opportunity to tell a story that should complement your resume.
Gotcha. So not a one for one. If it's on your resume, it's on your cover letter, but more of like hey, this is the stuff that maybe you either may have missed on my resume, or maybe I just didn't even have enough space to put it.
Right. It's so true. And a cover letter too is a really good opportunity to highlight pieces of information that again, don't necessarily fit on a resume, but they kind of tie the story together in a way that may not be obvious.
Subjective stuff.
Exactly. I'm trying to think of a specific example, but generally speaking, it will be a theme that maybe not super obvious on a resume, and a cover letter is a really good place to point it out, because you can literally just say it like point blank without trying to hide it somewhere in a bullet point.
Yeah. So, looks like we got a question. Yes. Hey, Sarah, what is your opinion on listing soft skills on your resume? Is it important to hit the keywords listed on the job description?
Great question. So yes, I think hard skills and soft skills are both very important. Generally speaking, and I write about this in the book too, but there's a section that I like to include on resumes called core competencies. And that's a great place to list both hard skills and soft skills, because it shows hiring manager or recruiter that you know what your skill set is and how it might apply to their opportunity. And I always put that at the top of a resume before you even get into your education and experience, because that's generally what's going to stand out to them, and those should be keywords that you take from the job description that align with your background and speak to your experience.
So with tech, there's a ton of different stuff that people are touching, and tools and languages and frameworks and stuff that they're using. Is it possible to list what you have in
I don't
your
think
skills?
so. In most of these cases, it's about space, right? Like we have an 8.5 by 11, generally speaking, of a sheet of paper, or like digitally or like tangible otherwise. But generally, I personally don't think you'll overlist, especially when you're talking about languages and coding languages. Now there's so many out there. A lot of companies require different ones that you be fluent in one or more, because there might be an e-com role, there might be something that's more like front end or back end, so it just really depends. Yeah, all over the place.
So is it pretty safe to say that with resumes, there's no one correct
it's
answer?
Not one size fits all.
Anything?
It's really not. No, but I think one of the key takeaways is that the goal is to make it so that you have a least common denominator product that can apply to as many or that can showcase as many skills as you possibly have for whatever opportunity you're applying for. And that being said too, I think I've said that depending on the roles you're applying for, it's really hard to have just one version of your resume. Like multiple versions are certainly encouraged, and I certainly encourage that, depending on the types of roles that you're applying for. And there's certainly ways to kind of button up your transferable skills for each version so that they apply to the opportunity that you're considering.
Gotcha. Are there any myths about resumes that you want to just dispel right here and now, that we're talking to the entire world? Because the most important people in the resume job searching world are right here, right now.
Any myths? Oh my goodness. I don't know of any myths per se. I will say, I think one of the most important things too is what you include is almost, if not more important than what you exclude. And so I don't think people should be focused on listing everything that they've done in a certain role on their resume. I think it's more important to choose the achievements very strategically and curate your narrative based on that. Because ultimately, like if you I'm not going to care if you're, a first prize winner in underwater basket weaving if you're applying for a sales job. Like, it's just not, like, those things just don't correlate. And like, it's really cool that you did that, and maybe there's an opportunity to address that in an interview.
Yeah.
Just because that's cool, but it's not relevant. Relevant is key.
Yeah. Maybe you leave the underwater basket weaving for the cover letter if you have extra space.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, by the way, I'm a award-winning underwater basket weaver.
So don't go with like 9-point font. Don't push the margins to the very edge of the page. Like,
make it readable. It needs to be legible. Again, no clip art, no photos, no just text, like lines, different marcating sections is fine, but just text. Really,
okay.
Just the text.
Okay, we got one more question here.
Yes. Mike asked, what are some outside of the box ideas that might make your resume stand out, like mailing it in an elaborate package?
Oh, interesting. That's so funny. I've gotten a few of those, and they're cool. And they're cool in the moment, but I don't really remember them afterwards. So, and that's just me. So I don't know if other hiring managers or recruiters have a similar experience.
I think it's an easy story to tell.
Yeah.
So like when it happens, like somebody might post about it, and you're like, "That's awesome." Or I heard one person who had they found out the favorite pizza place of the CEO, and then sent the resume on top of the pizza, delivered it to the person's office.
That's really creative.
So I think you can get creative, but part of it's also like a time.
Sure.
Like you got to balance it and decide. Is this worth this extra amount of time that I'm putting into it? Now, I guess maybe if you could kind of blast them out or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. That could get expensive too.
It could, yeah.
Pizza delivery.
Yeah.
That is clever. I don't know if I have a feeling or if I favor one approach more than the other. I think ultimately, again, going back to the idea of networking and reaching out to folks and getting those informationals, coffee chats, phone calls, whatever you want to call them. I think those are really the difference makers, especially long term in your career. Short term, you can do all the things that you're talking about. Making sure that your story and your professional narrative is presented as professionally as possible. But again, for most of us, I think the goal is the long term play too, to make sure that you have longevity in your career and that you're eventually getting a job that hopefully is your dream job, or at least something that you're happy doing, or something that you find value in and that you can put your skills well vested into. So that's kind of another takeaway I think to consider is, what are your goals in the short term, what are your goals in the long term, and what can you do to help yourself achieve both.
So speaking of kind of standing out, like getting the recruiter HR person's attention, following up can be really important. What do you think is like the appropriate kind of ways to follow up, amount of times to follow up, and and then of course what's the maybe what's the worst way to do it, so then people know what else is
okay. It's really interesting. Like I have seen too that ghosting is very common, and and I don't mean that to be a judgment. I think that's with the volume that a lot of these employers are dealing with.
Yeah.
Like it's not personal. It's really not. It's just a kind of a byproduct of the environment that we're living in, with so much stimuli and information. It's a lot.
Or just other day-to-day responsibilities.
Exactly. It's just a lot. So and I know that's really hard for job seekers, because it's your life and you're trying to find a job and you're trying to sustain your livelihood and move on and do all these really great things. And I know that's very difficult. Again, that's why I say being very intentional with how you build your long-term strategy is really important, because ultimately that's probably going to yield you better returns in the long run. But in terms of follow-up, I think a week, after a first interview, you send the initial thank you, and then wait a week, and then give them a week to respond. And then if you don't hear back from them, another second follow-up, and then after that I would just forget about it. I think that's probably for me, that's the safe
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've
And then
got
you
other
can focus
stuff
your
on your
energy.
plate.
Exactly. Focus
Yeah.
your energy on things that might be more, that might yield better returns.
Yeah. And it probably doesn't mean that, you know, necessarily you're completely like the wrong fit. There could have just been somebody that came in and like just happened to blow them out of the water.
I
Like,
agree. It's
it's
so
brutal.
true. It really is. And again, like going back to the idea of not taking it personally, it's really not personal. It's so much that I know it feels very personal because it's your work, it's your experience, it's, you know, you're putting in these efforts to be the best, and the best employee that you can be. But at the end of the day, you know, these are businesses that are trying to, you know, produce products, services, whatever, and they're just trying to, you know, keep their head above water while, you know, going through this process. So, and I say that like from an employer standpoint, I have also been on the job seeker side, so I totally get it, but I think it's important to empathize with both sides of the story to know kind of what's going on, and that in general, it's not personal. Especially for these like larger companies that maybe don't have the resources on their hiring teams, or you know, their hiring managers for whatever reason don't prioritize it. It's important to be realistic about your expectations.
Okay. I don't know if there's any more questions coming in. I think
That's
we covered
okay.
just about
Yeah,
everything.
we've
on
talked
the
about a
resume.
lot. I'm sorry. Yeah,
There's
drink
one
my water.
more.
One
Oh,
more.
there's one more.
Oh my goodness.
Natalie says, "Hi Sarah, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. After seeing thousands of resumes, wow, what is something that makes a resume memorable? Is there one example in particular that you can share?"
That's a great question. I think for me, the most important thing is to have the numbers to back up your experience. The ones that I remember the most are the like, wow, like you really did that. Like that's a lot of volume, or that's a lot of dollars, or that's a lot of people you managed, you know, like, wow, like you led the leaderboard for like 10 months with that much revenue. Like that's crazy, you know, like stuff like that. Like that to me not only illustrates that you made a huge impact, but you know your plate, you know what you've done to contribute to the organization, and you know what your impact has been. So that just from those pieces of information, I learn a lot about you, and how you think and how that's presented to me as a recruiter or hiring manager. So to me, those are the ones that stand out the most. I think that's the most important thing that job seekers can do in terms of communicating their value, right? And always the one question that I tell people to keep in mind when they're writing their resume is, why, like, would a hiring manager want to know this about me? Like, why would a hiring manager or recruiter want to hire me? And to use that as you calibrate what it is that you're improving. And if like a hiring manager, if you don't think a hiring manager wants to know that, or it's not important, like just don't put it on there. You know, and I know we're kind of risk averse creatures. Humans are very risk averse. So you're like, oh, like, well, what if I do, or what if I don't include that? Will that be the reason why I don't get hired? Like, probably not. You know, like probably not.
That one bullet point.
You know, yeah, that one bullet point really like should have like would have gotten me the job. It's very unlikely that is the case. You know, we're, you know, pretty intelligent creatures at the end of the day. I don't think we really give ourselves enough credit. Like we are, you know, and we need to be smart enough to use our brains to help us understand what our value is and then communicate that properly. I hope that answers your question.
And then probably getting, I mean, like you said, like people are smart. So if you even ask like friends and family, like, hey, would if I was applying for this job, would this be something that might get you excited?
Sure.
And you know, some of them might have no idea or no clue, but every once in a while you're gonna get somebody who's like, you know what, I really like that one, but that one not so much.
Absolutely. It's great to have, you know, like review groups or like people to give you feedback and anything. So I totally support that.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. And then, hi, this is from Rocky. What do you recommend for people who have very little experience to make their resume competitive? Many of us are people who have made the switch from tech recently. So in particular from non-tech to tech.
Absolutely. So this is where transferable skills are very important. And that's understanding, you know, how your non-tech background and the things that you've done or the things that you have achieved would translate into your tech background. A lot of it too is education-based or project-based, and to highlight those things. And then also using that section I was mentioning before, the core competencies at the top of your resume to really highlight the skills that you have. So that, again, the first thing that a hiring manager sees is like, oh, this person, you know, has these hard skills and soft skills, and I can go on to apply them skills are really important, and being able to make that connection is going to be important for the narrative.
And there's a lot of those.
There's so many. And that's really where the creativity comes into play. You know, it's like my clients, like all the time, like that's where a lot of them have trouble, is making that leap. And you know, not all of us are able to make those connections right away, but I promise you they're there. I promise.
So like, I'd imagine one of the things that like when you're working with clients, especially as they're maybe making a career change, or you know, I guess even if they are in their same, you know, same industry or same roles, yet they just haven't built a resume in a while, and you're trying to get some of these skills out of them.
Yeah.
Are there like questions that they can ask themselves, or does it maybe even help more to ask some of their coworkers or past people?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, so I have an intake form that's very comprehensive. So I get all of the stuff, like even the stuff that they don't necessarily think is relevant, so that I can draw those connections for them, right? But that's absolutely right. Like I think one of the questions I ask is just that, you know, like ask a few coworkers like what your greatest strengths are, and then have those, you know, just so I can understand what that looks like. It may not show up anywhere on the material, but at least as I'm writing it, I can help create that story with those things in mind.
Yeah. How did you make me sound so impressive?
I know, right?
Like you did
It's
it.
a gift.
Yeah.
Wait,
Your gift.
okay, you want to play a little game just to kind of demonstrate those transferable skills? So like, let's say that you only have customer service experience as a server, and you want to be a software developer. What are some of your bullets that you would put on your resume, or even in your about me?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Like, it's not just the customer service experience. I'm assuming that there is some more technical, because you're not. I wouldn't expect somebody to.
Well,
apply.
if you're working, you know, in a restaurant, so you're
Yeah.
probably working with a point of sale system.
Sure. Yeah.
Depending on your comfort level with that, maybe you were training other people on the team about how to use the point of sale system. I'd imagine, you know, trying to deal with a fast-paced environment,
Sure.
depending on the restaurant. Maybe you're working at like, you know, a nice, very easy to, you know, sit down place, but most of the time service, you know, work is pretty hectic.
Sure.
What else? You probably have to follow certain processes that have been put in place. Now, like pulling that stuff out and like getting like it to sound really good in like a restaurant, you know, bullet point is gonna be tough.
Yeah.
Teamwork,
Yeah,
always a great one.
Always organizational skills, multitasking.
Yeah.
Understanding requirements. Are all very important.
Not getting fired
Not getting fired.
helps too. Maybe put a bullet
Not to
point.
get fired.
4 years of not getting
Yeah,
fired.
right.
4 years of showing up late
Highlight of
5
my
minutes.
career.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's always something that kind of can be taken away from other roles, and it's really easy, you know, to be too self-critical and to say, oh, there's nothing that I have from here.
Agreed. Yeah.
I just don't think you want to put up roles where you clearly got fired for doing something wrong.
Sure.
Maybe that's one that you kind of leave off and highlight some of the others too.
Sure. I think strengths are really important. And you know too, you know, as an employee, what your strengths are and what your opportunities are, right? So it's very important to be mindful of that as well.
And then
Oh,
Sarah, this is like super kind of interviewy, but like, what are your personal goals for yourself in the upcoming like 3 years, or within 3 years? What are your top 3 goals you want to accomplish in 3 years?
Personally or professionally, or both?
Both.
Oh my goodness.
Oh.
That's very interesting.
You're on the hot seat.
Yeah, I know, right? That's amazing. So for me, so as we know, like I'm an author, and that's my passion. I just sent off my manuscript for my 10th book to my editor. So I would like to continue to build my backlist. So in 3 years, I hope, fun fact, I wrote 10 books since the pandemic. So a year and a half, 18 months. So I don't think I'll be able to keep that pace
Yeah,
going forward. I don't think that's realistic. But I would like to, let's just call it, I don't know, in the next 3 years, like have maybe another 10. So maybe 20 books, novels. I write novels, nonfiction, and poetry. So within that,
what was the recent one? The Crown of the Sea?
The Crown of the Sea. Yes. So this one's actually, I'm very excited about this book. So The Crown of the Sea is actually based on Princess Diana and the love triangle with Camilla and Charles. But what I did was I modernized it and I set it in Newport Beach, California, which is where I'm from. So I basically just took that storyline and thought, like, what if these people lived during this time in this place? What would that look like? And so that's what I wrote. So that's the manuscript. That's with my editor. It will be out later this month. I'm launching it June 28th. So mark your calendars. So that one, it'll be on Amazon. And then I'm also writing, I'm really into journaling. I have a journal called My Truth that's out there, but I'm writing a book, like a how-to on how to journal, to just give people advice and guidelines for how to the benefits of journaling, how to create journal prompts, how to follow journal prompts, just kind of, you know, something like that. So that's really important to me. That's really my focus. Obviously, I have my career consulting business. I'd love to grow that and scale that. I actually met with a friend of mine who's an app developer. So we're trying to figure out if there's ways to integrate technology to help me increase my volume. So I'd love to see that happen in 3 years. Yeah, I think those are really my kind of two, like professionally at least, that's kind of where my focus is. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah,
And
you're
then
welcome.
actually, what are your thoughts on if someone wants to turn one of your books into a movie?
Oh, dude, I'd be so down for that.
Wasn't even like a hesitation.
I know,
You're like,
right?
yes, we're
Oh,
gonna
I
sign.
thought about it.
Yeah.
It's great content, I'm telling you. I'm not just saying that. No, it's funny. I've written, I have, in addition to this one that's coming out, I have 2 novels. They're kind of like, I would describe them as the OC meets like the Mindy Kaling show, Never Have I Ever. So it's like a high school like romance teen stuff, like teen angsty things. Like again, I set them in Newport Beach because again, that's where I'm from. All my fiction is going to be based in Newport Beach, you guys. We'll just have to accept that. It's just the way it is. But yeah, so if anyone wants to, you know, is interested in that, please hit me up. I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, yo, what a way to end.
Amazing.
Cool. Well, this has been a lot of fun.
This has been great.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
I hope
we'll
you
have
guys
to do it
learned
again.
some good things.
Hopefully
Wait,
there
hold
wasn't too
on.
many distractions. I don't know what was
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, I know. They're like, you see like the passersby.
One more question, Sarah. Who are you wearing?
I'm not sure what the brand, but I shop at Common Thread on 17th Street in Costa Mesa. That's like, it's a woman-owned boutique. Her name's Stephanie. She's fantastic. That's where I get most of my clothes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for asking me, Cass. It's H&M, Lulu. Come on. I even got shark socks on today.
I love the shark socks. Very on brand.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. If you want to get in touch with me too, I'm online. You can find me by sarasalam.com. I have like a contact form thing. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff. So,
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Have
Thanks,
fun writing
guys.
resumes. Cool.
Yeah.
See y'all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. And it will be on our YouTube. All right. Bye, everyone.